So I'm going to talk about the natural history of ZC4H2 associated rare disorder. And just to start out with, I'll just tell you how I kind of got involved with this. So 3 years ago, I saw my first patient with ZARD, and I was talking with the family and trying to counsel with them about kind of what to expect in the future. And like I always do in these situations, I looked at the literature on ZARD. And I just realized there was just practically nothing out there in terms of, how do things change over time? What can I tell you to expect in the future? What are the best treatments for this disorder? There was really very, very little that was out there. And so I reached out to folks from the foundation and said, is this something that you guys would be interested in? Would this be valuable for us to do a natural history study? And I had just completed a natural history study of another rare disorder, KCNT1, and learned a lot from that. And so I thought it would be really valuable to try to do this in ZARD as well. Um, in general, what the purpose of a natural history study is, it's to understand the course of a disorder, to let families better plan for the future, identify potential best practices for treatments, and to set the stage for future clinical trials. Um, so in the ZARD natural history study, we actually, this is a little bit out of date because we actually have recruited several more children since then. But at the time I was preparing this, we had enrolled a total of 40 patients, 13 males and 27 females. And the way we did this was primarily with the help of the foundation. Folks, posted on the foundation website, and then there was also some word of mouth. And then I also recruited my own ZARD patients as well. And so we did this all virtually. So all participants had an initial interview and virtual physical examination via Zoom. And then we reviewed medical records, including the genetic report, EEG, MRI, and clinic notes, and then we followed participants every 6 months. So the study started in December of 2022, and we're still continuing. So we're still happy to enroll new participants, or happy to, and still following up all the participants that we initially enrolled. Um, this is just some background on the genetics. So just for background, there are a lot of different types of genetic mutations, and any of these can cause problems in ZARD. So one of the interesting things that we learned from this is that the vast majority of the boys with ZARD have what are called missense mutations. And so this is basically a misspelling in the DNA. So usually a single nucleotide change that results in a change in the ZC4H2 protein. Um, and um, and then boys also had what are called splice sites mutations. So these are mutations that affect the way the protein basically forms different isoforms. Um, so almost all the boys had either missense or splice site mutations, whereas in the girls, there was a lot more variety in terms of the types of mutations that the girls had. So many of the girls had a deletion. So basically, the copy of the gene was just missing, or frameshift mutations. And what that means is basically the DNA is out of alignment. So it ends up not making any or not much functional protein, or kind of a truncated protein, a smaller piece of the protein gets made. Um, and and so what this suggests basically is that boys in general don't tolerate deletions or frameshift mutations, whereas girls can, essentially, most likely because of the pattern of X inactivation and skewing. We had a single boy with a deletion, but unfortunately, he passed away in the neonatal intensive care unit. He was very severely affected and was never able, they were basically never able to get him extubated. Um, and that was a little boy at my own hospital where we diagnosed him basically at birth, and then followed him until the family made the decision to withdraw care eventually, after he'd been intubated for several months and they weren't able to make any progress. Um, so In terms of, one of the things that we're interested in is, are there genotype phenotype correlations? Can we predict what a child is going to be like just from the particular ZARD ZC4H2 mutation that they have? So one of the things that we found is that this is really different in boys and girls just because the boys really only have, in general, two types of mutations. They can have missense mutations or they can have splice site mutations, whereas the girls can have a lot of different types of mutations. So many of the boys with missense mutations did have kind of more severe cognitive impairment, and some of the boys also had fairly severe epilepsy. And then there's the complete gene deletion, which was, more severe. So the girls with missense and splice site mutations tended to have milder symptoms overall. Um, and whereas with the girls with the deletions often had kind of fairly significant motor impairment and were less likely to be able to walk or have good mobility. Um, so there were some features that were more common in males. So seizures were more common in males, and especially kind of more severe seizures. A lot of the boys also had intermittent pain. Often it was kind of hard to figure out what the cause of the pain was, but this was sort of a big issue for a number of the boys, as well as boys were more likely to have severe visual impairment, and problems with eating solid food. And boys were also more likely to have kind of a generalized distribution of muscle atrophy. Um, the girls overall were more likely to have kind of the classic arthrogryposis multiplex picture, with spasticity on exam, and were more likely to have just lower limb, just atrophy in the legs, with better musculature in the arms and hands. Um, and I will mention actually just that, while some of the girls did have seizures, in general, the seizures in girls were fairly treatment responsive, and were a lot easier to control. Um, so one of the things that I thought was interesting was language function. So 82% of participants, and this was true in both boys and girls, had much less impairment in receptive language than in expressive speech. And overall, the girls had better expressive speech than the males. One of the things that I thought was notable was that many participants reported that when their children were able to successfully communicate using communication devices like tablets, many families expressed that they really just had kind of an explosion of language and communication. And many people were kind of surprised at how much language their children had once they were able to get around this whole problem of expressive speech. And so I think that's something just sort of, for the community to be aware of, is that often, the children are maybe smarter and have better language than sometimes I think people are giving them credit for. And then if we can devise ways to help people, to help the children communicate with adaptive devices, then I think that a lot of the children probably could be doing a lot more. Um, so one of the things we looked at was kind of how overall symptoms changed over time. And so this was just, we asked people overall, how did their symptoms change over time? And the vast majority of people said either that their symptoms improved over time, or that some symptoms improved while others got worse or stayed the same. So then we asked, what symptoms tended to improve over time. And overall, it was very consistent that people had improvements in feeding, had improvements in their respiratory status, and had improvements with their mobility over time. And one of the things that I thought was notable was that we had a number of patients who had feeding tubes, gastrostomy tubes, placed when they were younger. And then eventually they were able to feed on their own and they were able to have the tubes removed. We also had several patients who had tracheostomy tubes placed for breathing breathing, and then eventually we're able to be decannulated, that is, to have the tracheostomy tube removed, and to be able to breathe on their own without support. And I think this is really important information for families to know, just because when families are getting G tubes or tracheostomy tubes, like in the NICU or things like that, often the NICU will say, we don't know if you're going to be able to get these out, but you should probably plan for this to be like you're probably going to have this for life. And so I think it's important for the families to know, if you do need a tube or, a feeding tube or a tracheostomy tube, it doesn't have to be forever. And many families actually are able to eventually transition to successfully feeding and breathing, without those tubes. Um, um, so one of the things that I think is kind of notable is that even though there are these small differences between boys and girls, there really is a ton of overlap in the severity and the range of symptoms between males and females with ZARD. And I think, there has been some, I guess, early papers that suggested maybe ZARD is a major problem in boys and girls aren't really that affected. And I think it's important to know that's not true, that there really is quite a bit of overlap between boys and girls, with ZARD. There are several symptoms that are more common in one sex than the other, but all of the symptoms really can happen in either sex. So as the ZARD natural history study continues, we'll continue to evaluate symptom trajectories and optimal treatments for children with ZARD. I will just mention, just kind of some things that I think are quite interesting. So one is that, as I think everyone here on the call knows, tethered cord is extremely common, in ZARD. And one thing is that it doesn't often the tethered cord doesn't look like a classic tethered cord. It's often quite subtle. And sometimes the neurosurgeons have reported that they didn't really know if the cord was tethered or not until they were doing the surgery, and then they realized it was tethered. And it's not everyone reports like huge improvements after the tethered cord surgery, but a lot of people do. And the things that many people noted were, improvements in spasticity, improvements in pain, and especially improvements in urinary function. So those patients that were having a lot of urinary retention before the tethered cord surgery often noted that resolved, after the surgery. So I think that's something that's just important for everybody who is treating children with ZARD to know, is screen for the tethered cord and think about trying to fix it if there's any hints that there could be a tethered cord there. As the natural history study continues, one of the things I'm really interested in is the optimal treatments for spasticity or contractures in this population. And I think that's something that, we don't have enough information on that yet, but it does seem like in a lot of patients, and probably not in some of the folks in this call, because you guys are everybody on this call I think is really on top of the kind of contracture and spasticity management. But I think in a number of patients, the spasticity and contractures are kind of undertreated, and we probably just need to collect information, on kind of what's working, what's not working. And I think that'll be really valuable information for the community going forward. So I want to leave, plenty of time, for questions. I will just, I do want to let people know, so that the first paper from the ZARD natural history study, is hopefully going to be published soon in Pediatric Neurology. It got good reviews, and just had minor revisions we have to, submit. And so I'm going to share all that with everybody, as soon as that is out. And I do want to let everybody know as well that all the data from the natural history study will be given to the foundation. I just need to de-identify the data, and then you guys are all welcome, to have that data. So I'll stop and see what questions people have.